So what makes someone a Christian and what makes someone not a Christian? What makes, like that's what I'm trying to figure out. Because
That's a good question.
Yes.
Yeah, well, probably the deepest answer to that is
This section was by far the most healthiest part of the Jordan Peterson versus 20 atheist debate that I've seen. JP went on after this debate to say that he liked this part the most with her, and it makes sense since the questions she asked were really solid despite what you guys might feel about Peterson. But let's get into it.
my next claim is that everybody worships something, including atheists, even though they might not know it.
Hi.
Good work.
Thank you.
Hi there.
I'm Zena. So I want to start off with like defining terms.
Yep.
How do you define worship?
Prioritize.
Prioritize. So almost like having a preference over something rather than the
It's a
other.
hierarchy of preferences.
Yeah.
And you use it to direct your attention.
Right.
So whatever you're attending to, you're worshiping.
Right. So I've kind of become a little bit familiar with your idea of like this value-laden hierarchy.
Yeah.
Right. And you kind of posit that at the bottom of this hierarchy, or you call it top or bottom, I
Yeah,
suppose. At the bottom of this hierarchy, this foundational priority in your life is going to be considered God.
That's
Is that
right.
correct?
Yes.
Right. I'm trying to imagine a situation in which could there be that someone has a priority at their foundation that is different from someone else's?
Oh, definitely.
Right. So we can have different conceptions of God.
That's why we fight.
Right. So essentially, there's not one God, but there are multiple gods, and these gods exist in some realm of truth. It's true that this person has one God and it exists.
Yeah, probably better to think about it as multiple values, but that there's a hierarchy of values with something at the bottom.
Right. But at the
Or
bottom is
top.
God, and there
That's
are
a definition, yeah.
yeah. So at the bottom is God, and there can be multiple people with different conceptions of God, and they're each valid in being called God. So there are multiple gods that exist.
It depends on what you mean by valid. So far, so good, but it depends on what you mean by valid, because I would say that some foundational conceptions don't play out when they're implemented. So if you put the wrong thing at the foundation, you end up in hell, for example. That's
Peterson is saying that God is whatever sits at the bottom of your value hierarchy, your foundational principle. But then she asks a really good question. If everyone has different foundational values, then aren't there multiple gods? And he admits, yeah, sure, multiple people can have different gods. Because if everyone's foundational value counts as a god, we're just making the word meaningless. God becomes whatever someone happens to care about. Then he tries to clean it up by saying that, well, not all foundational values are good. Some lead to hell. Some values are better than others.
what happens in totalitarian states.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're saying
So they're not all equal. Like, all foundational principles are not equal, even though they might be equally foundational. Right?
So what makes one kind of foundational tenet like better than another one?
That's an excellent question. Iterability. Imagine that you play a game with someone and you're a kid, and it's fun. So then you play again and again and again.
So
then
repetition.
it's playability across multiple iterations. So then you have a friend, and a friend is better than having a game. Right? So that's one. Breadth of application is another. So if it's just for me now, it's not as good as something that would be benefit to both of us across time.
Right. So we're explaining like characteristics that can be applied to like these types of like foundational values. But why is it that this iterability makes it better, and what does better mean?
Well, one hallmark of better is likely to be selected voluntarily. So it's invitational.
Another descriptive kind of quality. So we're talking about characteristics that in some type of system with a goal, an output being like, we could maybe say happiness, right? Or some type of
harmony.
Harmony, right?
Yeah, that's better. Not happiness precisely, because it's too short term.
Exactly. So as someone who is an atheist, right, I can explain that within a system, there are things that we can see as better or worse to meet this goal or meet this output. But what we're interested in, though, is what could make these things, regardless of any system, right?
Well, imagine that you set up a system and you implement it, and it produces the opposite results to which you intend. Oh yeah, that's not a good system.
Exactly.
Right, so the foundational principles are lacking, because when you implement them, the game degenerates instead of moving towards the aim.
Right,
Okay,
so we're talking about
okay.
within a system. When we talk about something being moral, right, just absolutely moral, it means that without a system, right, this thing is simply moral with no reason. Like, stance independent, this thing is good. So I'm trying to figure out if such thing can exist. And if so, do you believe that these things are moral in of themselves, like self-evidently moral, or are they moral in accordance with the system?
I can't define them any more accurately than I already did, really.
Okay. In regards to morality, when we talk about the divine, when we talk about God and religion, these moral tenets and religion, right, and God exists as good because it is God, right? So it's self-evident, right? Without any kind of goal or output, this thing is good. So I want to figure out how...
There's an element of that that's true. So, for example, in the story of Job, Job is unfairly tortured in consequence of a bet between God and Satan. And so Job is emblematic of someone who's being hurt for no apparent reason. Okay, so Job's response to that is that he refuses to lose faith in himself, and he refuses to lose faith in the ultimate goodness of being. Okay, and those are axiomatic decisions. They're not exactly evidence dependent because he is suffering. There's an arbitrariness in that that's reminiscent of what you claim.
So I'm essentially trying to figure out, do you believe that something can be good, like stance independently, something that can be good?
I don't know what you mean by stance independent.
Okay, so
you
I
mean
mean
independent of people?
Independent of people, we can use that, or more so, I want to be more specific, something that can be good, right, regardless of any end goal. It's just good.
No, I think good is tied up with goal.
Goal, okay, I completely agree. So in a sense, this is why...
That's why the religious goal in Christianity is the establishment of the kingdom of heaven on earth. It's goal dependent.
Okay, right.
So it's
Okay, that's fine. Good is always goal dependent. But again, that kind of contradicts traditional religious language. If good is only good because it works towards a goal, then it's just functional, not really sacred. So now even morality is reduced to what works? I don't think that's God. That's just ethics dressed up in biblical language.
it's in reference to a goal.
So,
Or the goal would be the
but
imitation of Christ.
someone's goal, right, can be something that doesn't encompass being in congruence with God or being with God.
No, the
can that be
thing
true?
that they want to be incongruent.
Oh, right, okay.
Hang
It
on
is
a
God.
sec. That's right. That's
Sorry,
right. That's
I
right. That's
corrected
good. That's
myself.
great. The thing they want to be in congruence with is fundamentally equivalent to their God.
So what makes someone a Christian and what makes someone not a Christian? What makes, like that's what I'm trying to figure out. Because
That's a good question.
yes.
Yeah, well,
you.
probably the deepest answer to that is willingness to shoulder your cross voluntarily and trudge uphill regardless of circumstances.
Okay, so someone can have a God, because in your definition, your first preference, that is God, right? So someone can believe in God, right, and not be a Christian, right?
Yeah, well, there's a statement that Christ makes in the Gospels. He says, not everyone who says, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven.
So not that they're even saying that they believe in God, but they just...
I know, but that's why I'm saying this to you, is that Christ himself points out that there's a difference between people who say they believe and people who act it out. And the fundamental issue is the action rather than the stated belief.
But he also says that, to be saved, right, you must believe God has died for your sins, or that God has resurrected in some way. So it's like, I don't necessarily think that we can take from the Bible and say that, like, acting in accordance with God necessarily means, or acting in accordance with, the principles of God, like, for example, sacrifice, like you talk about, means that you are Christian. I don't see how you can get that from that interpretation and then, kind of justify it as the true
I don't think that the fact that you sacrifice is sufficient to make you Christian.
So can we repeat once again what you believe makes someone Christian?
There's many things, but one of the most fundamental is that you believe that the cosmos itself is founded on the principle of voluntary self-sacrifice. Best founded. Let me offer you a contrary example. So I could assume that power rules. And so that my assumption would be, if I can make you do it, I win. Right, and I can found a whole society on that, and that happens a lot, by the way. And that's also how societies tend to degenerate. And so that would be a society that was founded on the principle that you get to sacrifice and I don't have to. Right, now the contrary to that would be something like, you give up voluntarily and with courage all the things you need to situate yourself properly in relationship to the future and other people. Right. So then there's a harmony. That's why I talked about harmony earlier.
So you navigate your life, right, in accordance kind of to this principle of self-sacrifice. Can I say it in that way?
Yes, you can definitely say it that way. That's exactly right. And navigate is the right term.
So someone does not have to have any awareness of Christ, of the story of Jesus, but let's say 60% of their actions, right, or more, whatever kind of metric you want to use, are in line with this self-sacrificial.
So the Christian thinkers of the Middle Ages dealt exactly with that problem when they were talking about the pre-Christian philosophers, for example. And they noted the similarity, let's say, between pre-Christian Greek thought and later Christian thought, and presumed that there were moral actors outside the Christian domain.
Right.
They're
So is that person
addressing the
Christian,
same-
though? Is that person
Well,
Christian?
to some degree, again, that's a matter of definition, because
Exactly.
they wouldn't be proclaiming Christian propositions, but they're acting out the pattern,
Of
right? So,
Christianity.
yeah, so you imagine that full Christianity would involve a dozen things, and you can imagine someone who knows nothing of Christianity, say, acting out 8 of them.
Right.
Right.
So
then they'd be 8/12ths Christian or something
8,
like
12
that.
Christian.
Well,
but to be like a full Christian, how can someone say I am Christian? Like I am Christian, not 8/12, but Christian.
Well,
don't understand.
I hesitate to do that personally, because
Okay.
I think it's the kind of goal that you be very careful about proclaiming. The technical.
But belief is not necessarily, to be mostly Christian, belief is not necessary. 8/12s or, right?
Well,
I can agree with that standpoint. A question would be, someone is a Christian because they act in alignment with Christian values, even if they don't believe in Christ. To which Peterson says, yes, if you live with voluntary self-sacrifice, you're like 60% Christian, which again sounds poetic, but it ignores the actual Christian doctrine. Personally, I don't think you become Christian because you behave nicely. Christianity, in its own terms, is belief in the death and resurrection of Jesus. So now, is Christianity a sliding scale? You can be 8/12 Christian? Let me know in the comments below.
it depends on what you mean by belief. See, because I would say that acting out the pattern is the deepest form of belief. Now, you could add to that what you say. So, maybe in the optimal situation, how you act
how you say
and what you imagine and what you say, they're the same. Right? But you can imagine a hypocrite who says all sorts of wonderful things and does nothing, and you could imagine another person who acts in a very positive manner but proclaims nothing.
So
right?
what I'm kind of seeing is like a descriptive, a really comprehensive but descriptive analysis of human action, human thought, and by which we can characterize people and put people in boxes. But I don't see,
Why in boxes?
like, when I say in boxes, I mean like I can categorize you based on your actions, not based on necessarily what you say, but based on your actions that you are more so or less so Christian, right? Things like that, right? So we can categorize people as Christian.
Well, I would say more or less voluntarily self-sacrificing.
But that's also what we came to, though, is that someone can be like 60% or 70% Christian based on simply just acting in that way.
Yeah, Richard Dawkins is like that.
I watched that debate.
Pause there.
I feel like in the same sense that can go for any religion in general. If you act with kindness, or if you act with some sort of self-valued sacrifice, then technically you can be, 20% Muslim or, 50% Buddhist. I don't personally think that it works that way. You're either a person who completely believes in the religion or you're not. And if you're not, then you're believing in something else entirely. But I'm curious to know what your guys' thoughts are, so let me know down in the comments below. I personally think that this part of the debate was the best one. It seemed pretty healthy overall. Nobody was yelling or screaming at each other for once. And the points that they brought up was pretty valid. I do think that her points were pretty strong and thoughtful, and it even seemed like Jordan Peterson was actually having a good time answering these questions. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. I'll make another section on this, and just watch as the next person that comes up here is what really makes this debate heated. So stay tuned for that.